Well, g'day and welcome back to another episode of the StoneX Australian Cattle and Beef Market Report. My name is Ripley Atkinson. I'm the Australian Meats and Livestock Manager for StoneX based in Sydney, where we're developing price risk management tools for the Australian livestock industry to help the sector manage market and price volatility with our Australian feeder cattle forward contract. We're brought to you by StoneX Group, a NASDAQ listed global financial services network with 100 years of experience in global commodity markets. Remember that the trading of derivatives, such as futures, options, and over-the-counter products or swaps, may not be suitable for all investors. Derivatives trading involves substantial risk of loss, and you should fully understand the risks prior to trading. Past results are not necessarily indicative of future results. Back into the markets today after last episode with Adam and Ben in Kansas City. That was a really productive conversation. I found really interesting. If you haven't listened to it, would encourage you to go back, find it. There's plenty of really insightful insights in there from their views on the US and where it's at. But today we're going to jump into a few of the major data pieces or reports released in the last week or so, and that is the Alpha MLA Q2 feedlot report, and secondly, the Q2 slaughter and production numbers from the Australian Bureau of Statistics. I'll kick off with the feedlot report. It was, I would say, generally in line with expectations. I think what it did really highlight, and probably the biggest aspect to really understand from the numbers, is New South Wales and Queensland particularly continue to extend their lead and sort of dominant positions over the feedlotting sector. And that growth in capacity, numbers on feed, and of course turn-off is really being driven by New South Wales and Queensland. The other smaller states, Vic, SA and WA, they're either firm to a little softer. So you're either seeing sort of stable results or some contraction in those states. And New South Wales and Queensland simply continued to expand across all those key metrics that the report monitors. I'll begin with capacity and numbers on feed. Capacity is basically the amount of available pen space for cattle to sit within in feedlots across the country. More pens were built, and that was acknowledged in this report for Q2. It was up 5% or 88,500 head compared to the same quarter in 2025. So now the available capacity for numbers of cattle on feed in the country is 1.88 million head. So, starting to push towards 2 million. And it wasn't that long ago that you were looking at 1.3 to 1.4 million, such as the growth we've seen in the last 5 to 6 years, which has been discussed at length. As mentioned, New South Wales and Queensland were really driving that. Numbers on feed on the back of that capacity, or the actual cattle in pens across the country, very strong. So up another 5% year on year, sort of matching the growth in capacity itself. So there's 1.66 million head of cattle on feed across the country. This year we should see Queensland tick over 1 million head of cattle on feed in 2026. And both of those New South Wales and Queensland states, again, very dominant. 91% of cattle on feed in Australia reside within Queensland and New South Wales. And year on year growth was up 9% for Queensland and 7% for New South Wales. Again, just a real point to highlight is how dominant they are, without seeing a whole lot of substantial change from those other smaller states. Now, there could be multitude of reasons for that lack of expansion, but really the dominant sectors here, or dominant states that are expanding, are New South Wales and Queensland. I think there's a few things there, in terms of why we're seeing these sustained higher numbers of cattle turned out of feedlots. And I'll get onto that in a minute. But what really encapsulates it is obviously the number of cattle on feed and the additional pen space being built, but then also the fact that feedlotters have been shortening days on feed, and the amount of time cattle spend in feedlots, that combination of those factors is driving these high turn-off volumes. And of course, in Q1 and Q2 of 2026, we've seen that happen because of the rush to get cattle out the door to China and things like that. So the reduction in the amount of time cattle are spending in pens, and the fact that there's simply more cattle on feed, is really starting to sustain these high turn-off numbers. It wasn't 4 years ago that 600,000 to 700,000 head of cattle turned out of a feedlot was a lot. For 2 consecutive quarters, we're now seeing 1 million head of cattle, grain-fed cattle, turned out of feedlots each quarter. That's a fairly substantial step up in a relatively short amount of time. The big one, though, aside from capacity and numbers on feed, really is utilization. And what that measures is the number of cattle on feed as a percentage of the total capacity by both Australian or national levels and by state. Queensland particularly, that was the biggest takeaway for me. Queensland feedlots have never been fuller at the same time as having that many cattle in pens. So their utilization rate was 98.4%, and year on year that had lifted 5.1%. So it's Queensland, as I say, Queensland feedlots have never been fuller, and year on year, that utilization of pen space is stronger by 5%. Seasonally, though, for New South Wales, its utilization rate was actually back 5.3%, sort of offsetting Queensland's increase. It's still sitting at 90.1%, so still seasonally and historically very strong in terms of the actual utilization rates of pens across the country. I suspect that sort of reduction in utilization, down 5% year on year in New South Wales, is more to do with a lack of local supply. I think obviously the Queensland livestock managers for feedlots have been out competing those in New South Wales and drawing cattle from, northern and central New South Wales up into their pens. And that may have a little bit to do with it, alongside the fact that there's a lack of cattle in New South Wales suitable for entering feedlots through Q2. A lot of those cattle, we've got to remember, were sold earlier in the year or adjusted into other locations when the first 4 or 5 months of 26 was dry for those regions. Moving into turn-off, again, really interesting to see that sustained level of 2 consecutive quarters where we've seen more than 1 million head of cattle turned out of feedlots in a row. I think we needed to see some data, and I've mentioned this before, whether it was an anomaly related to the fact that brands, processors, and the supply chain was rushing to get product into China and South Korea, or whether it could be sustained. And by the looks of it, there does seem to me to be a trend establishing whereby we will see regular numbers up around this 900,000 to 1 million head turned out more consistently. And what that's really underpinned by is the fact that we're now over 1.65 million head of cattle on feed. So they're going to have to keep moving through the system. And coupled with that, of course, is the fact that days on feed has been shortened up as well. Now, whether the days on feed trend remains sort of shorter in inverted commas for Q3 and Q4 of this year, time will tell. But it does give you an indication that this trend of higher grain-fed throughput or high grain-fed turn-off can be sustained. When we look at what that means from a slaughter perspective, new high was set from a weekly basis for grain-fed kill. We averaged 81,000 head of grain-fed cattle processed per week in Q2. And if we combine year-to-date or year to 30th of June grain-fed turn-off, and compare it to the corresponding period last year, grain-fed kill or grain-fed turn-off was up 20%, or 345,000 head on the same period in 2025. My forecast released from the H2 Outlook report by StoneX of 3.9 million head out of feedlots in 2026. I'm going to keep the same. And my belief underpinning why that's not going to change is there could be some adjustments in Q3 and Q4 to turn off, driven by economics within the feedlot due to the dislocation between cattle prices and fed cattle prices, or feeder prices, I should say, and fed cattle prices. But I think ultimately the real highlight here is the fact that that 1 million head has been sustained for 2 consecutive quarters. Obviously, both of those are encapsulating that period leading up to the China and South Korea quotas being hit. But regardless, it's just that continued indication set by the market further down the supply chain, which I think is really important to understand from a producer perspective, is processors, brands, exporters, the like are all prioritizing access to grain-fed cattle in their plants and in their businesses. And what that has meant is those signals are moving back to the feedlots, and the feedlots are acknowledging that they are chasing more grain-fed cattle as a share of total slaughter on a weekly, monthly, quarterly basis within those processing plants across the eastern seaboard. And that has meant that has encouraged those feedlots to expand as well. Breaking the turn-off numbers down at a state level, again, I mentioned this from the last Q1 report. A really good example of feedlots continuing to shorten days on feed is the fact that Queensland's turn-off lifted 22% year on year, but its cattle on feed numbers only lifted 9%. So there's a gap there between the 22% lift in turn-off and only a 9% lift in numbers on feed. That 13% difference tells you cattle were moving through the system faster than those moving onto feed, if that makes sense. Again, a little bit similar in New South Wales. Turn-off numbers had lifted 21%, or they were up nearly 47,500 head year on year. Vic also, it experienced some pretty strong growth, admittedly off a low base. It was up 17%. Whereas South Australia and WA, they led to weaker results. South Australia turn-off numbers down 12% and WA down 17%. I think Q3 and Q4 should give us a bit more of an understanding on whether this contraction or stable results out of these smaller states continues, or whether it was sort of an anomaly and seasonally it picks back up. But it does seem to be occurring that we're not seeing anywhere near the investment and expansion in the smaller states feeding capacity and numbers of cattle going through the system. Seems to be remaining pretty constant to slightly smaller. So the next couple of quarters of data should begin to give us a bit more of an indication of whether it was simply an anomaly and an increase begins to appear, or whether this remains the status quo in terms of their limited interest in expansion. Moving on to the ABS numbers, these are reported by the Australian Bureau of Statistics about 6 weeks after every quarter ends, and this is sort of the data which is recognised really as the gold standard in terms of where we can get our slaughter and production numbers, because the NLRS report is voluntary, so it's not a mandatorily reported data set. It's just from those processors providing goodwill who voluntarily submit their numbers to Meat and Livestock Australia on a weekly basis. The NLRS numbers don't capture the whole market, whereas the ABS numbers do. So on a slaughter perspective for Q2 26, all sorts of records, historical highs were set. We processed 2.52 million head of cattle. That was the highest level of any quarter since 1978. New South Wales, Victoria, and Tasmania had their best quarters since 1978 and 79 respectively. Queensland had its best result since Q3 2015. Weekly slaughter numbers, we averaged 194,000 head through processing plants across the country each week. That was growth of 8% year on year, or compared to the same quarter in 25, and the highest weekly throughput numbers since Q3 1978 as well. So across the board, really significant, impressive results generally. Q2 isn't traditionally seen as a seasonal peak in supply. That's usually reserved for quarter three, particularly out of northern regions of the country where turn off from a seasonal perspective is at its peak. And you begin to get those southern sort of spring cattle beginning to turn up into the system as well. But to see this result perform the way it did, I think it tells you a couple of things. The first is it's showing that pull forward of turn off of cattle out of drought affected regions throughout central eastern Australia. We saw, sort of March through to June of this year, regions like central and northern New South Wales and southern Queensland. And that's coming up in the female, or the numbers of females processed as well. We saw some really big results out of New South Wales in terms of its female kill for Q2, and the contribution of sort of liquidation through those central eastern regions in quarter two is adding to why we've seen Q2 as a whole, from a slaughter perspective, outperform what we'd usually expect. Looking or splitting up grass and grain-fed kill numbers, as I mentioned, grain-fed numbers up to a new high of 81,000 on average per week, which again, like I was mentioning a minute ago, gives you that good indication of processors prioritising sourcing grain-fed cattle because of the consistency of supply. Grass-fed numbers were also up. So grass-fed kill lifted 17% quarter on quarter, but compared to the same quarter in 25, the numbers were stable. What I think that tells you is, as I mentioned a minute ago, the overall increase in slaughter numbers for Q2 was very strong, but that was really underpinned by the increase in female kill, or cows, basically. That's why you've seen that grass-fed kill number lift so substantially, but compared to the corresponding period in 2025, it was relatively consistent. So in addition to these really strong results from a slaughter perspective, 50-year highs in slaughter, carcass weights were pretty stable year on year. They dropped back a little bit compared to quarter one, but that was mainly to do with the fact that there was a sort of a bit of a reduction or an increase in cow kill or female kill, and that meant that it dragged the average carcass weights back to 309 kilos a head, down from 317 kilos in quarter one of this year. But what the combination of historically elevated carcass weights and 50-year highs in slaughter means beef production reached a new record high of 780,000 metric tonnes. So again, really significant result there. And now when we compare the first half of this year to the first half of last year, from a production perspective, beef production was up 8% or 114,000 metric tonnes, comparing the two time periods, and slaughter numbers, they were up 7% or an extra 313,000 head put through processing plants in the first half of this year compared to last year. What explains that 1% difference in the lift between slaughter of 7% up year on year and beef production up 8%? That difference of 1% can be explained by heavier carcass weights. And obviously that's also got to do with the record numbers of, I shouldn't say record, but the really strong numbers of grain-fed kill cattle we're putting through processing plants that is holding up overall beef production and output. What I think this does highlight again, which I've mentioned in the previous episode back in May about how plants are performing. So New South Wales, Queensland and Victoria, they accounted for 89% of the total national kill and were operating above 97% in terms of where their percentile rank sits compared to the last 10 years of quarterly kill data. So basically they're doing more than they've done for recent history. And I think the question that I keep asking myself about this situation is, how much higher can the kill go, or how much more can we be putting through the system or through processing facilities if drought-induced turn-off is forced upon the supply chain, particularly out of Queensland. So again, the big regions of cattle supply out of the north of Roma, have experienced such a strong season again in 2026, but we already have processing facilities operating at capacity. So when you do see drought-induced or dry conditions forcing turn-off, you'll see grass-fed turn-off rise quite substantially because cattle are quit earlier and obviously more cows start to exit the system, but Queensland is in a really healthy position. So that is the question that I think we need to keep reminding ourselves is how much higher can the processing sector push throughput before that capacity becomes an issue. So we're already at capacity in Q2, but the broader north is in a strong position from a seasonal perspective. I think the second thing that does need to be highlighted and acknowledged, and really one of the big things about what both of these reports are telling you, is how strong and how large the herd size is at the minute. It's something I've discussed and been raising on this podcast for some time. These numbers aren't an accident. Numbers of cattle on feed, numbers of cattle turned out of feedlots, slaughter volumes, production, etc. None of it's an accident. What this shows to you is the growth in the herd size and the availability of cattle supply in this country at the minute. And it's a really good indication in terms of the recovery that processors have also made. So looking at the data in Q2 of 2022 for the corresponding 10-year period, slaughter volumes were at their third percentile. So basically their lowest they'd been in that 10-year window. When you compare that Q2 2022 result to Q2 2026, so the quarter we're discussing now, slaughter numbers were in the 98th percentile for that period on record, or for any period on record for that matter. It gives you a really good indication, the difference between the third percentile and the 98th percentile, of how strong the recovery has been from processors between the lows seen during the rebuild and where we're at now in the cycle, which is nearing the cycle highs from a production perspective. It's a really clear representation that processors have well and truly fully recovered, and they are matching the ability to handle these big numbers of cattle that are coming through the system, underpinned by that herd size I'm talking about. Another thing I think that needs to be acknowledged here is the role Victoria plays from a national perspective in terms of its contribution processing-wise. So for context, Victoria's herd, its cattle herd, only accounts for 11% of the total national herd. Yet for Q2, Victoria's processing volumes accounted for 23%, which is more than double the numbers of cattle in the country. What that tells you from a cattle movements and flow perspective is Victoria's never been pulling more cattle out of other states than it has now. It's always done it. It's always been something, a role that's played. But I think now, as it's expanded so significantly and those processing businesses within the state have expanded their capacity and their throughput, what it suggests to me is how long can this continue to last where Victoria drags cattle out of Northern Australia, New South Wales, Queensland, the Territory, WA, etc. How long can it continue to keep pulling those numbers out of the system in those regions before that has an effect on the actual availability of cattle supply in those places? So it's never been more competitive now for processors across the broader eastern seaboard to access cattle, and that's obviously to do with the expanded system. But I think what I'm sort of wrestling with is how does that drag or pull from the north into Victoria and more broadly Southern Australia, how long can Queensland continue to prop up the broader east? I suspect it will be a little while because of the productivity and the capacity in the herd, but it is something to continue to monitor, and one we need to keep aware of. Understanding flows as well of cattle, New South Wales, on the feedlot side, New South Wales and Queensland, they're clearly the dominant players. So from a supply chain and producer perspective, how do you begin to think about, the role these states or regions play at a macro level, and what does that mean for you at an individual level when seeking markets or opportunities for cattle to be sold? And understanding that bigger picture and flows of how Queensland is supplying New South Wales and Victoria, or even the Northern Territory is supplying those southern states and regions with kill cattle. What does that mean for you in the location you are, and where does that fit from getting access to space for kill capacity if you're a grass-fed producer as well? All these sorts of things, these reports, they create those types of questions, and I think it answers a fair few of them, but it does provide an opportunity to have a bit of a deeper think about what that means from an individual level, from a cattle flows level across the country, and from where those big markets and those big opportunities are to secure, space if you're a grass-fed producer, or if you're selling cows, all those sorts of things, where the best opportunity is from a feedlot perspective. It's a really interesting sort of group of data, and I think it's well worth understanding from a broader perspective because of what it's telling us at the minute. And I think to wrap up, really, all this is showing us is the scale of how large the herd is at the minute, and ultimately the availability of cattle supply, the recovery, and the ability of processors to handle these big numbers of cattle. But conversely and finally, the fact that processing plants are full. So the question becomes how much more space can be squeezed out of the system to accommodate higher numbers if Northern Australia were to go dry or have a wet season which encouraged turn off due to its below average conditions. That's all for this week. So if today's episode has raised any questions, I know there's a fair bit in it, make sure you reach out to me and send me an email to ripley.atkinson@stonex.com, or record a voice note of yourself, where you're from and the question, and we'll get to answering it in the next episode. Make sure to share this with any of your mates or colleagues. There's a fair bit in this, so the more people that get access to it and understand what's going on, I think the better. We want to share as much information with as many people as possible. And if you're enjoying it, make sure you give it a follow or a rating on your favourite listening platform. Thank you for listening, and until next time, take care. Cheers.